She thought she texted a stranger, but that number had buried secrets that refused to stay dead. Ava Carter's fingers trembled as she stared at the cracked screen of her phone, the dim glow barely lighting the tiny apartment that smelled faintly of cold air and formula powder. Her baby boy burning against her chest, his skin too warm, his tiny breaths uneven and shallow as she rocked him gently in the silence of 2:13 a.m. The city outside her window humming with distant sirens and passing cars that never slowed for people like her. People who had to count every dollar and pray it stretched far enough to make it through the night. And right now, she didn't even have $11. Not for medicine, not for relief, not for anything except the crushing weight of knowing she was out of options. Her bank account empty, her last paycheck already swallowed by rent and overdue bills. Her phone filled with unanswered messages to people who had long since stopped responding. And so she did the only thing desperation allowed. She opened a random contact, a number she barely recognized. Her vision blurred with exhaustion and fear as she typed slowly, carefully, like each word might break if she moved too fast. "I'm sorry to bother you. I just need $11 for my baby's medicine. I'll pay you back, I promise." And for a moment her thumb hovered over the screen, doubt clawing at her chest, because this was ridiculous, embarrassing, hopeless. But then her baby whimpered, a soft, fragile sound that cut through every ounce of pride she had left, and she pressed send, the message disappearing into the void as if it had never existed, and Ava let out a shaky breath, pulling her child closer as she whispered softly, "It's okay. Mama's got you." Even though she wasn't sure that was true anymore, even though the walls around her felt thinner by the second, as if the night itself was closing in, and somewhere across the city, far beyond the reach of her world, a phone buzzed once on a polished glass table, the sound sharp against the quiet of a room filled with men who spoke in low, controlled voices, a room where decisions shaped lives without ever raising a hand. And the man at the head of that table didn't reach for the phone immediately, his expression unreadable, his presence heavy in a way that made others sit straighter without realizing it, until the buzz came again, softer this time, and something about the persistence, the timing, the interruption of a night that was supposed to follow a very different path made his eyes shift ever so slightly toward the screen. And when he finally picked it up, when he read those few simple words sent from a stranger who had no idea who she had just reached, the room seemed to hold its breath, not because of what was written, but because of what it stirred in him, something quiet, something buried, something that hadn't been touched in a very long time. And for the first time that night, Dominic Rossi didn't look like a man in control of everything. He looked like someone remembering something he never wanted to feel again, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, waiting, as if the night itself was about to change direction without warning. The hallway was darker than Dominic expected, the overhead light flickering faintly as he stepped inside, the air carrying a quiet stillness that felt untouched by the kind of urgency that had brought him there. And yet he moved forward without hesitation, his footsteps soft against the worn floor as he followed the numbers on the doors, each one bringing him closer to something he still had not fully defined, something that did not belong to his world and yet now held his full attention. And upstairs, Ava sat frozen on the edge of her bed, her entire body alert despite the exhaustion weighing on her. The sound of movement outside her door unmistakable now, slow, deliberate. Not the careless noise of a neighbor, not the random shuffle of someone passing by, but something focused, intentional, and her breath grew shallow as she looked toward the door, her instincts telling her to stay silent, to wait, to protect what little she had, her arms tightening instinctively around her baby as if she could shield him from whatever was coming. And then there was a knock, firm but not aggressive, just enough to break the fragile quiet that had been holding the night together. And Ava's heart jumped into her throat as she stared at the door, her mind racing through possibilities she did not want to consider, because no one came here at this hour unless something was wrong, unless something had already gone too far. And for a moment she did nothing, her body locked between fear and the need to act, until the knock came again, slightly softer this time. And something about that change, that restraint, made her hesitate in a different way, and slowly, carefully, she shifted off the bed, her bare feet silent against the floor as she moved closer, her hand trembling as it hovered near the handle, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked, "Who is it?" The words fragile, uncertain, and on the other side Dominic stood still, his expression unreadable, his presence filling the narrow space without effort, and when he spoke his voice was calm, controlled, carrying none of the tension that had brought him there. "You sent a message," he said, simply, not raising his tone, not explaining further, just enough to reach her through the door, and Ava froze, her mind struggling to catch up, her eyes widening as she looked at her phone lying on the bed behind her, the memory of that desperate message flashing back with a clarity that made her chest tighten, and for a second she considered stepping away, pretending she had said nothing, that this was a mistake she could still undo. But her baby shifted in her arms, a soft, strained sound, escaping him, and that was enough, because whatever waited on the other side of that door, it could not be worse than doing nothing, and with a slow breath she unlocked it, the faint click echoing louder than it should have in the quiet apartment. And when she opened it just a few inches, the hallway light spilled in, revealing a man she had never seen before, dressed in dark, clean lines that did not belong in a place like this, his posture straight, his eyes steady, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the air between them heavy with everything unsaid, until Ava finally found her voice, small but steady enough to carry. "I think you have the wrong person," she said, even as she knew that was not true, and Dominic's gaze did not waver as he looked past her, just briefly, catching the outline of the small room, the worn furniture, the quiet evidence of a life lived carefully, and then back to her. And something in his expression softened just slightly, not enough to be called kindness, but enough to change the weight of the moment. "No," he said quietly. "I do not think I do." And the silence that followed felt different now, no longer filled with fear alone, but with something else, something neither of them had expected when this night began. The door opened just enough for the silence between them to breathe, and Ava felt it immediately, the shift from fear into something heavier, something harder to name, because the man standing in front of her did not look like trouble in the way she had learned to recognize it. There was no rush in him, no impatience, no careless glance around the room, only a stillness that made her more aware of herself, of the worn fabric of her shirt, of the way her hair had come loose, of the child in her arms who let out a weak sound as if reminding her why she had opened that door in the first place. And Dominic noticed it too, his eyes lowering just briefly to the baby, not staring, not intruding, but observing in a way that felt precise. And when he looked back at her, something in his gaze had sharpened, not with suspicion, but with quiet certainty, as if the message he had read now had a face, a reality that could not be dismissed, and Ava swallowed, her grip tightening slightly as she shifted her weight, unsure whether to close the door or open it wider, caught in a moment that had no clear direction. "I should not have sent that," she said softly, her voice carrying a hint of apology that she could not hide, because saying it out loud made it real, made it feel smaller somehow, like a mistake she needed to take back. But Dominic did not move, did not step forward or away. He simply stood there, absorbing her words without reacting immediately, and when he finally spoke, his tone was even, almost quiet. "You needed help," he said, not as a question, not as a judgment, but as a statement that left no room for denial. And Ava hesitated, her eyes flickering for a second before she nodded, just once, because there was no point pretending anymore, not when he was already here, not when he had seen enough to understand more than she wanted him to. And for a moment neither of them spoke again, the hallway light casting a soft outline around him, while the dim glow inside her apartment revealed just enough of her world to tell its own story. And then Dominic reached into his coat, the movement slow, deliberate, and Ava tensed instinctively, her body reacting before her mind could reason through it. But he did not pull out money, not yet. Instead he held his phone up slightly, the screen lighting his features as he showed her the message she had sent, her own words staring back at her in stark clarity, and something about seeing it from the outside, from his perspective, made her chest tighten, because it looked smaller than it had felt, more vulnerable than she had intended. And she lowered her gaze briefly, a quiet flush of embarrassment rising. But Dominic did not comment on it, did not use it. He simply lowered the phone again and said, "Is he running a fever?" And the question caught her off guard, simple and direct in a way she had not expected, and she nodded quickly this time, stepping back just slightly without thinking, creating a small opening. A silent invitation she did not fully realize she had given, and Dominic noticed, his eyes flickering once to the space beyond the door before returning to her, and without hesitation, without asking again, he stepped forward, crossing the threshold into a world that had nothing to do with his own, and as the door closed behind him, the night outside faded, leaving only the quiet, the dim light, and a moment that neither of them could undo, because from this point on, everything had already changed. The apartment felt smaller the moment Dominic stepped inside, not because of the space itself, but because of the contrast he carried with him, the quiet authority that did not belong among chipped paint and worn furniture. And Ava felt it immediately, the shift in the air as she closed the door behind him, her back pressing against it for just a second longer than necessary, as if grounding herself in something familiar, while he moved forward without hesitation, his gaze taking in the room in a single sweep, not judging, not lingering, just understanding, and then settling on the baby in her arms, who let out a soft, strained breath that seemed louder in the silence. And Dominic stepped closer, his movements measured, stopping just within arm's reach, his eyes focused now with a kind of clarity that left no room for uncertainty. "May I?" he asked, his voice low, controlled, and Ava hesitated, her instincts pulling in two directions at once. But there was something in his tone that did not feel like a command, something that left the choice with her, and slowly, carefully, she shifted the baby slightly so he could see better, her hands still supporting every inch of him as if letting go was not an option she could consider. And Dominic leaned in just enough to observe, his hand lifting, briefly before pausing midair, not touching, just feeling the warmth radiating from the child, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly as he processed it. And then he straightened, reaching into his coat again, this time pulling out his phone, his fingers moving quickly across the screen as he spoke without looking up. "When did the fever start?" And Ava blinked, caught off guard by the question. "A few hours ago," she answered softly, her voice steadier now, guided by the rhythm of answering instead of fearing. "He has not been able to keep anything down." And Dominic nodded once, his attention still on the phone, sending a message that required no explanation, and within seconds he slipped it back into his pocket, the decision already made. "Someone is coming," he said simply, and Ava froze, her eyes widening slightly as the words settled in, because nothing in her world worked that fast. Nothing arrived without delay, without complication, and she shook her head. Instinctively, "I cannot afford." But he cut her off gently, not with force, but with certainty. "This is not about what you can afford," he said, his gaze meeting hers again, steady and unyielding in a way that made her stop, because there was no room to argue with something she did not understand, and the silence that followed felt different now, less fragile, less uncertain, as if the moment had shifted into something more solid, something that did not rely on hope alone. And Ava slowly moved back toward the bed, sitting down carefully as she adjusted the baby in her arms, her movements still cautious, still protective, but no longer frantic. And Dominic remained standing for a moment before pulling a chair closer, not asking, not announcing it, just sitting down in a way that felt natural, as if he had already decided to stay, his presence no longer at the door, but within the space, part of it now. And for the first time since the night began, Ava allowed herself to breathe just a little deeper, her shoulders lowering slightly as she watched him, still unsure of who he really was, still uncertain of what this meant, but no longer alone in the quiet, and outside the city continued as it always did, unaware that in one small apartment, something had shifted, something quiet and irreversible, as two worlds that were never meant to meet now shared the same silence. Time moved differently in that small apartment, slower, heavier, as if every second carried more weight than it should, and Ava became aware of it in the way her breathing began to match the quiet rhythm of the room, no longer rushed, no longer panicked, just waiting, while Dominic sat across from her, his posture composed, his gaze occasionally shifting from the baby to the door and back again, not restless, not impatient, but alert in a way that suggested he was used to waiting for outcomes that mattered, and neither of them spoke for a while. the silence stretching but not breaking, until Ava finally glanced at him, her voice hesitant but steadier than before. "You did not have to come," she said softly, as if testing the truth of it. And Dominic did not answer immediately, his eyes remaining on the child for a moment longer before he looked at her, something unreadable passing through his expression. "I know," he said simply, and there was no explanation attached, no justification, just the statement itself. And that made it harder to question, because it was not about obligation, it was about choice, and Ava lowered her gaze slightly, absorbing that in a way she had not expected. And then from outside the building came the faint sound of a car pulling up, tires rolling to a stop with a quiet finality that cut through the stillness, and Dominic's attention shifted instantly, his body straightening just slightly, not tense, but ready. And within moments there were footsteps in the hallway, quicker than before, purposeful but controlled, followed by a knock on the door that echoed more confidently than the one that had come earlier, and Ava's heart skipped again, her eyes darting to Dominic, searching for reassurance she did not fully understand, and he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough, and she stood carefully, adjusting the baby before moving toward the door, her steps slower this time, less uncertain. And when she opened it, two figures stood outside, one holding a small black case, the other stepping slightly back, their presence calm, professional, and completely out of place in a building like this. And before Ava could speak, Dominic's voice came from behind her, steady and direct. "Come in." And they did, without hesitation, moving past her with quiet efficiency, their focus immediately shifting to the child, and Ava stepped aside instinctively, her mind trying to catch up with what was happening, with how quickly everything had changed, and one of them spoke gently, introducing himself, his tone reassuring, asking simple questions that Ava answered almost automatically, her voice growing steadier with each response as the process gave her something to hold on to, something structured in the middle of the uncertainty. And Dominic remained where he was, watching, not interfering, not directing, but present in a way that anchored the room. And as the small examination began, the baby stirred slightly, letting out a soft sound that seemed less strained than before, and Ava noticed it immediately, her shoulders easing just a fraction, hope slipping in quietly where fear had been, and she looked at Dominic without realizing it, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand what had brought him here, what had made him stay. And for a brief moment, something in his expression shifted again, softer than before, almost unguarded, before it disappeared just as quickly, leaving only the same calm control, and the room settled into a new kind of silence, one filled not with fear, but with the quiet possibility that things might actually be okay. The room settled into a quiet rhythm as the man with the black case worked with calm precision, his movements practiced, his voice low and steady as he checked the baby's temperature again, adjusted the small blanket, and prepared a liquid medication that caught the soft light from the lamp. And Ava watched every motion closely, her eyes following his hands as if understanding each step could somehow guarantee the outcome, her fingers brushing gently over her child's forehead, noticing the slightest change, the smallest difference. And when the baby let out a softer breath, less strained than before, something inside her loosened, not fully, not completely, but enough to let hope slip in where fear had been holding everything tight. And the man nodded slightly as he worked. "It is a high fever, but manageable," he said in a reassuring tone, his words measured, chosen carefully. He should begin to respond within the hour. And Ava exhaled slowly, a breath she had been holding for longer than she realized, her shoulders lowering just a fraction as she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper, "Thank you." And though the words were directed toward the man in front of her, her eyes flickered briefly toward Dominic, because she knew none of this would have happened without him. And Dominic remained where he was, his presence steady, his gaze observing everything without interruption, as if he were measuring something beyond what was visible, something internal, something that had been stirred the moment he read that message. And as the medication was carefully given, the baby stirred again, this time settling more quickly, his small body relaxing in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. And Ava noticed immediately, her hand pausing for a second as she felt the change, her eyes widening just slightly before softening. relief washing over her in quiet waves that did not need to be spoken, and the room seemed to exhale with her, the tension easing into something gentler, something more human, and the man finished his work with a final check, offering a few simple instructions in a calm, steady voice, making sure she understood how to continue caring for the fever through the night. And Ava listened carefully, nodding with a focus that came from necessity, from the deep instinct to protect and sustain. And when it was done, when the case was closed and the quiet professionalism of the moment began to fade, the room felt different again, not heavy, not uncertain, but grounded, and Dominic finally stood, the movement drawing Ava's attention back to him as he stepped forward just slightly, his gaze resting briefly on the now sleeping child, his expression unreadable but no longer distant. And then he reached into his coat once more, this time pulling out a small envelope, plain and unmarked, and he placed it gently on the table beside her without explanation, without ceremony, as if it were simply another step in a process that did not need words. And Ava looked at it, then at him, her lips parting slightly as if to speak, to question, to thank, but the words did not come, because something about the moment made them unnecessary. And Dominic met her gaze one last time, his voice quiet, steady. "Next time, do not wait this long," he said, not as a reprimand, but as something closer to a reminder, something that carried weight without pressure. And then he turned, moving toward the door with the same calm certainty he had carried from the beginning. And as the door opened and the hallway light returned, Ava remained where she was, her hand resting gently on her child, her eyes following him until he stepped out into the night again, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt empty, but full of something she could not quite name, something that would stay long after the door closed. The door closed with a soft, final click, and for a moment Ava just stood there, her hand still resting on the edge of the table where the envelope lay, as if moving too quickly might undo everything that had just happened, the silence settling around her once more, but no longer carrying the same weight it had before. And she turned slowly, her gaze drifting back to the bed where her baby now slept more peacefully, his breathing steadier, his small body no longer tense with discomfort. And she moved closer, lowering herself carefully beside him, her fingers brushing lightly over his cheek, feeling the warmth that was still there, but softer now, less alarming. And she let out a quiet breath, one that carried relief and disbelief in equal measure, because nights like this did not usually end this way, not in her world, not for someone like her. And yet here she was, sitting in a room that looked exactly the same as it had a few hours ago, but felt entirely different, as if something unseen had shifted its foundation. And her eyes drifted back to the envelope, curiosity finally overcoming hesitation as she reached for it, her fingers moving slowly, almost cautiously, as she opened it and glanced inside. And whatever she saw made her pause, her breath catching just slightly, not because of the amount itself, but because of what it represented, not charity, not pity, but something quieter, something that did not come with conditions or expectations. And she closed it again, her hand resting over it for a moment before setting it aside, her attention returning to her child, because that was what mattered most. Always, and outside, the night carried on as if nothing had changed, the distant hum of traffic continuing its steady rhythm, while Dominic stepped out into the cool air, the door behind him fading into the background as he walked back toward his car, his expression composed, his movements controlled, but something in his gaze lingered just a fraction longer than usual, as if part of him had not fully left that small apartment. And when he reached the car, he paused for a moment before getting in, his hand resting briefly on the door, his eyes lifting toward the building one last time, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledging. And then he slid into the driver's seat, the engine starting with a low, familiar hum. And as he drove away, the city lights reflected across the windshield once again, but they did not feel quite the same, not as distant, not as disconnected, because somewhere between the silence of a message and the quiet of that room, something had shifted in a way that could not be measured or explained, only felt. And back inside, Ava adjusted the blanket one more time, her movements gentle, her breathing steady now as she leaned back against the wall, her eyes closing just for a moment, not from exhaustion alone, but from the release of a fear she had carried for too long. And in that stillness, with her child safe beside her and the echo of a stranger's quiet kindness lingering in the air, the night finally allowed itself to rest. And in that quiet, without words, without promises, something simple remained, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. And that night, the world remembered what dignity looks like.